everyone, Bethany here. Before we get started, I wanted to tell you about something new we are doing with our Patreon. As you may know, Patreon is a place to donate and support creators, like us, who bring you cool stuff, like this podcast. We'd like to raise enough money to pay our editors and producers and to upgrade some of our equipment so we can bring you our dulcet tones every week. As part of that, we are redoing our Patreon tiers, and now, when you donate, you'll get the option to receive awesome stuff, like Science for the People stickers, magnets, mugs, and more. Not only that, if you support us for $5 per month or more, we'll send you a special birthday card. It won't be on your birthday. Instead, it will be on the birthday of a scientist we think is worth knowing about. The card will include custom art of the scientist and their work, and a special memorable note about their contribution to the world. Who's the scientist? That's the big surprise. To get the first one, all you have to do is sign up by May 15th and support us for $5 or more each month. And really, $5 for 4 hours of podcasts and some swag? That's a really good deal. Thanks. Now, on to the show.
The views expressed on Science for the People are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
This week on Science for the People, we're time traveling to the heroic age of medicine. We're going to talk with Nils Hansson about the advent of anesthesia and how it changed the world of surgery. But first, we're going to venture into the laudable pus and blood-coated world of Lindsey Fitzharris and her new book, The Butchering Art, Joseph Lister's quest to transform the grisly world of Victorian medicine. Hold on to your breakfast. Welcome to Science for the People. I'm Bethany Brookshire, science writer at Science News and Society for Science in the Public. When you think of surgery, what do you think of? Probably pain, probably fear. But you may also think of sterile white walls, bright lights in an operating theater, doctors in white coats, everything made to look as clean as possible. Surgery has always involved pain and fear, but it has not always involved that sterile, clean operating theater. In the 1800s, doctors did not know that was even necessary. They didn't know that their instruments needed to be clean. They didn't wash their hands. They had no idea that infections were caused by bacteria and called pus laudable. But in the mid-1800s, that began to change. And a large part of the cleanup of surgery was due to Joseph Lister. Here to tell us about it is science and medical historian Lindsey Fitzharris, author of the new book, The Butchering Art, Joseph Lister's Quest to Transform the Grisly World of Victorian Medicine. Lindsey, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm sorry it's taken so long to connect up, but I'm really excited to have this chat with you.
No worries. Now, you have a degree in the history of science and medicine. What got you into studying the history aspect specifically?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I've always been interested in history. I mean, I remember in Chicago going to the Museum of Science and Industry and being more fascinated with what they called the olden time street. They had this like street where you could walk down, and it was all made to look like it was, I think, turn of the 20th century. And so I was just always really interested in that. But I also have an interest in science and medicine as well. And when I went to Illinois Wesleyan, where I did my undergraduate, I was just really lucky to have a professor at this very small university who specialized in science history. And he introduced me to the subject, and I fell in love with it. And I said, where can I go to learn more about this? And we set it up so that I did an abroad program at Oxford University. I went over to Oxford. I went more down this rabbit hole of science history, and I went back to do my master's and my PhD, and I just absolutely loved it. So it kind of just randomly happened, but I've always been interested in history since I was a little girl.
And you also tend to like, well, in your YouTube series and also in the book, you tend to like the more grisly aspects of science history.
It's true. I mean, I guess it's funny because I was just filming something with my friend Alex Anstey, who shoots my YouTube series, and we were in a graveyard yesterday, and I was telling this story about how as a little girl I used to drag my grandmother from cemetery to cemetery hunting ghosts. We used to like to go ghost hunting, but my grandmother was very much of a generation that you would go to a cemetery and you would pay respect to the relatives, and she would tell me these wonderful stories about these people who lived in the past. So I think on the surface, a lot of people look at it and say, oh, you were a really strange child and you were obsessed with death. But for me, graveyards were never creepy places. They were places of love where people would go and remember their relatives and talk about the past and what it was like to live in the past. And that really sparked my interest in history as well. But it is true that I kind of, shift towards the more gruesome aspects of history, especially online. And I like to say, I've done a lot of articles and YouTube videos on human skin books, for instance. And these books that were bound in human skin in the 19th century for various reasons. A criminal was executed and they used the skin to bind a book about his crimes. And I like to say that I tell people, come for the skin book and stay for the history, because it's true, we're very morbidly curious. And so I think that pulls an audience in, and hopefully once they come to my page or they come to my YouTube series or my blog or whatever, they actually learn something about the context of these kind of grisly aspects of the past.
I was actually really hoping it was just the phrase laudable pus, because I just can't get over the phrase laudable pus. I love it.
I know they could, surgeons back then, for people listening in who haven't read The Butchering Art, surgeons would call pus laudable. And the reason why was because they didn't understand germs, and more often than not, an injury or a wound would begin to suppurate and pus would form. And so it happened so frequently that surgeons actually thought that pus was necessary for the process of healing. So they actually encouraged and were happy to see pus when it started to form, not realizing that it's a form of infection.
Well, I've decided that my next Baroque quartet is going to be called Laudable Pus.
Laudable Pus, yeah.
Laudable Pus, I love it. Now, I wanted to ask about what made you fixate specifically about writing a book about Joseph Lister? What really appealed about him?
Well, that's so funny. This book was sort of born in a time when I was going through a really difficult divorce, and I was facing deportation from Britain as a result. I didn't have any money. And all I could do was write. They took my passport. My situation was being decided in courts. And I thought, I have to write a book. And it should be a character-driven story, because that's what I excel in. And I actually originally was going to write it about the surgeon Robert Liston, who opens The Butchering Art, because he's such a character. He was 6'2" in the Victorian period, which was quite tall. He was very strong. He was the fastest knife in the West End. He could hold you down with his left arm, and he could take off your leg in under 30 seconds. And I thought, this guy is all theater, and he's an amazing character, but he doesn't really do anything to transform surgery or medicine. He does perform the first ever operation under ether in Britain, but it's not his discovery. He only hears about it from America and tests it out here. And so that's how the book actually opens. But when I was reading about that moment, the great Robert Liston going into this theater in December of 1846, he comes into this theater and he says he doesn't believe ether is going to work. He calls it the Yankee Dodge. And it works, and it's an amazing moment. And I think that when people, if they ever think about medical history, they think of the moment when anesthesia is discovered as the moment that surgery is transformed. But actually, surgery becomes a lot more dangerous right immediately after that, because the surgeon is more willing to pick up the knife, but he doesn't understand that germs exist. So as a result, these operations become slow-moving executions for the patients. So I really wanted to focus on that. And the most amazing part of that story about ether and about Robert Liston here in Britain was that in the audience that day was a 17-year-old Joseph Lister. And I thought, well, I couldn't write the movie script better than that. And so the book should open like that. But when I was doing my research and discovered Lister was in the audience, I thought, oh yeah, Joseph Lister, he's really important. And as an academic, he's written on, I'm aware that academics write on him quite frequently. I assumed that someone had done this book. And I kind of joke that, it's a writer's fear that you go out on book tour and someone says, did you know about this, other book that was written, 3 years ago? Someone already beat you to the punch, but nobody had written it. And, it's a story. It's so important. The New York Times, when they reviewed the book, said it was a paradigm so obvious that it's hardly believable that it needed shifting in the first place, because we now live in this world where we know germs exist. But of course, there was a time when people didn't know germs existed, and Lister received a lot of backlash as well for his ideas.
Well, I have to say, first of all, I'm a little sad it's not about Liston, because man, hold you down with your left hand and take your leg off with your right. That's what I look for in a man.
Yeah,
I know.
definitely, when we get the movie off the ground, Liston's going to be a really fun character to bring to life on screen, because he is such a character. He dies quite young, actually. I believe he dies in his late 40s or early 50s of an aneurysm. But he is a character, and a lot of these people around Lister in this medical world in the 19th century were characters. I mean, there were doctors and surgeons who would fight duels over, various points of discussion. They would disagree and they'd fight a duel. And so when Lister comes onto the scene, the people who win, so-called arguments about medicine, about what's the best procedure, often are just the best debaters. There wasn't really any kind of methodology in place. But Lister comes on and he has a microscope, which is a big part of the story and the butchering art. And the way that he writes up his case notes as well, it's like you're looking over his shoulder and he's demonstrating to you how to do things. And this was very different to how other doctors wrote about their work at this time. So Lister is very much a pioneer in the scientific method, and he's, explaining and showing, he's bringing evidence to what he's saying, he's changing his ideas, and in fact, he changes his methodologies quite often enough that doctors criticize him and say, well, see, you were wrong the first time around. So he's just a very interesting character. And he's sort of at the eye of the storm. And it's a period when a lot of patients are dying and, there's no solution to this problem in the hospitals. And he just happens to be, the right man at the right time.
Now, you mentioned that you had a lot of primary documents. I wanted to talk a little bit about the research that goes into writing a book like this. Where do you get primary sources like that? How do you do research about a guy who existed in the 1800s?
Well, I mean, Lister lived into his own fame, which was really good for me because a lot of the documents surrounding him, letters, for instance, that he wrote between him and his father, all of that was preserved because people recognized that he was important even in his own lifetime. But weirdly, as he neared the end of his life, he wanted a lot of his personal correspondence to be destroyed because he wanted his story to be told only through his science. But lucky for me, that didn't happen. And I think that's the power, hopefully, of the story that I tell, because Lister, it's not, nothing's created in a vacuum. And he's not only just building on the theories of other scientists and other doctors around him, but also he has this amazing relationship with his father who encourages him to go back into medicine after he has a mental breakdown. So there's a lot of wonderful moments about the people around him that make him who he is. And I think that we couldn't really understand Lister's significance without knowing that part of the story. But to get back to the research materials, there's tons of stuff in Britain. I live over here in the UK. The Wellcome Collection's an amazing medical history collection. They have a lot of stuff related to Lister, including even his microscope and actual, tangible objects that he used. The Royal College of Surgeons has stuff. There's a lot of stuff up in Scotland. So I was really lucky. The biggest challenge for me was because he lived into his own fame, because there's so many documents, I had to whittle this story down to, its fastest paced narrative. And also keeping in mind that my readers, my target readers are not going to be specialists. They're not going to necessarily have a PhD in the history of medicine. So I wanted that story to be both understandable and interesting enough to keep turning the page. And that was what was so hard, is taking this just massive wealth of material and saying, okay, well, this part of the story maybe isn't something that needs to go in the book. And there was a lot of stuff that had to be discarded, really.
And you mentioned that he lived into his own fame, and he made a lot of effort to be remembered only for his medical accomplishments. Why was he kind of fixated on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it was just a very Victorian sensibility that his private life had really nothing to do with what his science was, which was incorrect. I would argue, but I think he was just a deeply private person. He wasn't looking for fame either. And there's sort of Lister mania. In fact, I'm actually participating in an event in Glasgow in 2 months called Lister Mania. And they have an actor who's going to dress as Joseph Lister and interview me on the stage. So that should be interesting. But people still, especially over here, the UK audience really know Lister's name and are quite familiar with it in a way that they aren't familiar with it in the US. And I have to remind Americans that if you know Lister's name, but you don't know why, it's because of the product Listerine. He went to Philadelphia in 1876 to convince American surgeons of the need to adopt antisepsis and the need to accept germ theory. And while he was there was a man in the audience who was inspired to create this product and name it after him. He actually was a little bit miffed that this thing existed, and it wasn't a mouthwash at first. It was more commonly used to cure gonorrhea, which I tell people it's a little life hack for you. Just throw some throw some Listerine on your gonorrhea. But there's other things that spring out of this. Everybody starts going crazy over carbolic acid, which is the antisepsis that he uses. So there's sort of this carbolic acid mania. There's even a song, the carbolic acid ragtime in the 19th century. So people really kind of go nuts over this. And he is held up as the champion of germ theory and of antisepsis. But he didn't want to live into that fame. So I think the reason why he really wanted his private life to stay private was because there was so much interest in him at the end of his life. And he probably just feared that, this would all come out, and it was his private life. So I joke that he'd probably hate my book because I wrote this sort of, inner chamber of Joseph Lister's life, but I really feel that it's integral to the story. And I think we need to focus on, in this day and age, not just the science and the truth that prevails, but, how does that come about? And a lot of that is the deeply personal stories behind it.
Well, I have to say that if I were him, I can see why, having something named after you that's used to cure an STD would be kind of a turnoff. Yeah,
I could see that too. Yeah, that wasn't the best thing for him. But
what are you saying? But it does seem throughout the book, it seems like you did have a little bit of a struggle finding some of those personal details. Did you have trouble finding some of those personal details? Where did you get them?
Yeah, well, the one thing that was hard was his marriage to Agnes. There were gaps there. I mean, there are things that exist that tell us a lot about Agnes in certain ways. And there was this choice, do I go down that rabbit hole and bring her to the foreground? My decision with my editor was that we really wanted to focus on Lister and Pasteur, who features prominently in the middle parts of the book. But Agnes, his wife, they had a very close relationship, and she actually was responsible, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, for really kind of keeping him on track, because he would get lost in his research many times. And there's stories about him, having to present a lecture in an hour and he hasn't even started to make notes. And Agnes was always kind of there helping with that, transcribing his notes and keeping him focused. There's a question as to why they didn't have children. It seems like they probably anticipated that they were going to have children because they buy a house and they talk about the nursery, the room that would be the nursery, but then children don't emerge. But this is a Victorian times, and there's just nothing really out there that explains why they couldn't have children, or whether they had, whether this was a source of pain, which I'm assuming it was. There's just a few little glimpses of it in letters from Joseph Lister to his father about this. And there was this suggestion that Agnes had suffered from some kind of childhood illness that may have made her infertile. But again, I couldn't really find any evidence of what that sickness would have been. So it's frustrating because there's limitations. And of course, with a book like this, it reads like a novel. And I feel like I have a novelist instinct, but you have to stick to the story as it's known in the records. And so it's difficult, that you can't expand into further areas of his private life when you would want to.
All right. Let's have some fun with the grisly stuff. What was surgery like in the early 1800s? Go!
Now we get to the testicles flying off and,
Oh, yes.
This is the stuff that, it's funny, a lot of reporters focus on too. And I don't mind, because I think, it gets people into that story. They want the blood and guts. What's funny to me is when people review the book and they say, oh, it was too gruesome. And you think, it's called the butchering art. What were you expecting when you bought this book? And also, I like to point out to people that whenever they think that the descriptions maybe went a little too far, it's not actually usually me describing it. It's contemporary records. So this is how people were conceptualizing their own experiences and how they saw the period. So you get these stories, for instance, about Hector Berlioz, who ended up being a composer, but he went to medical school early on, and he walks into the dead house, what they call the dissection room, and he remembers the skulls gaping and the rats nibbling on the bleeding vertebrae, and he just has these amazing descriptions, and he's actually so mortified by this experience, he runs, he jumps out the window and he runs out of there, he says, as though death in all of his army is on his heels. And so it's just this incredible experience. And I like to remind medical students or doctors today that going into medicine in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, would have been very dangerous because they didn't understand germs. This was a time before mass vaccinations. It was a time certainly before antibiotics. So a lot of medical students actually die because they're exposed to various diseases, or they cut their hand during a dissection, and they call these pinprick cuts, and you would die from a bacterial infection. In fact, Charles Darwin's uncle by the same name is dissecting a child, and he cuts his hand and he's dead within 48 hours of some kind of septic condition. So it was a very dangerous time to go into medicine. And for the patient, it obviously sucked. This is before anesthesia and before an understanding of germs. So you go into the operating theater, you'd be fully awake. The operating theater would be filled to the rafters with people, and not just medical students or other doctors, but sometimes just ticketed spectators who came to see the whole thing play out, the life and death struggle play out on the stage before them, because the Victorians were obsessed with this. And a lot of times people ask me, were the Victorians more morbid than us? But I think, I have 130,000 people on my Instagram page. I think we're still pretty morbid. And I like to remind people, too, that the Victorians were obsessed with science. So a lot of them were coming to the operating theater to see the latest operation or the latest invention or discovery, like ether. And so it wasn't really just to do with the patient or seeing the bloodbath that kind of ensued. But it would be wrong to say that these surgeons relished in it necessarily. You get a lot of descriptions of surgeons being very nervous before they go into the operating theater, even vomiting before they go in, because you can imagine this person's life is in your hands and they're going to be struggling against your knife. And any small slip of it, could result in death. So there was a ton of pressure on the surgeons themselves. And so as theatrical or is sort of, I don't want to say funny, but, as entertaining as these stories are to us now that we live in a totally different time period, I think that, it's good to remind people that these were real patients. They were real surgeons as well who had to do this, and it could be quite an awful spectacle.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, as you mentioned, there was a lot of spectacle. It was the heroic age of medicine, fast knives flying everywhere. And actually, in the context of this, Lister did something really relatively quiet.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about what Lister's contributions to medicine really were?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Again, it's like, when I think about the period, I think about a lot of color and frenzy, as you say, the knives flying, the showmanship, the time me gentlemen, as the surgeons would walk in and try to compete with one another. And then you have Lister, this Quaker, this somber figure, who actually didn't really want to go into medicine at one point, but is kind of pushed back into this path, and thank goodness he was. And the way that he revolutionized medicine is a quiet revolution in the sense that once he discovers germ theory through Louis Pasteur's work, and he decides that is indeed what is causing these septic conditions, and he develops antisepsis, and he knows that he's right, there is a lot of pushback. But he decides that he can't necessarily change the older generation because, again, essentially what he was telling these surgeons was that they had been killing their patients all along. And I think that was a hard pill for them to swallow because they were trying to save people's lives. And what he was also asking these showmen who had grown up, as Liston had, the fastest knife in the West End, he was telling them to slow down, to look at surgery as a meticulous, slow-moving process rather than, get in and get out as fast as you can. So what he did was he turned to the younger generation and he started to change their minds. And they went out into the world and they became known as the Listerians. And so it's almost like a religious movement. And the way that he convinced them as well was through a lot of ceremony and ritual. Like he would bring in this carbolic spray, and it was all very solemn, and he was a very solemn figure, and they would follow him into the operating theater, and they would spray the air with the antisepsis, and there was a lot of kind of almost ritual involved in preparing the patient, and doing everything as meticulous as you can. But it was Lister at the center teaching these younger men, and it was those younger men going out into the wider world that actually ended up changing and shifting the paradigm. So he was a quiet figure. He was unlikely, an unlikely champion at a time when a lot of people were very boisterous. And as I said before, the loudest person kind of won the debate. But I think that's what's so magnificent, especially in this political climate, to have someone who is standing up for what he believes to be true, that he has the scientific evidence to believe that this is true, and just keeps going in the face of all this pushback.
And you mentioned earlier that he has this microscope,
Yes.
and he ends up developing this whole procedure. How did he discover the whole concept of sepsis and the whole concept of infection, basically?
Well, I mean, he didn't discover, sepsis was just everywhere, right? I mean, people were dying at such high frequencies in these hospitals that it was actually seriously suggested that the only way to solve the problem was to burn the hospitals down from time to time, which I love this kind of image. And we're certainly going to explore this idea in the movie, because, you could just imagine, like, what would that involve? Like every, 5 years, you just burn it down, you build again. But that's how critical the situation had become. And a lot of surgeons and doctors didn't know what to do to control it. If you had a crowded ward and you had someone come on with a septic condition, it could spread within hours, and patients could start dying within 24 hours. So it was very serious. So he didn't discover septic conditions. They were there. They were always there. And it was very frustrating. His own mother ends up dying of erysipelas, one of the major septic conditions that he's fighting against in the hospitals. And so critical had the situation become that they actually coined a term called hospitalism, which referred to this idea that you were more likely to die as a result of being in the hospital than out. And I'd like to also remind people that hospitals were very much places for the poor at this time. If you were wealthy, you would be treated at home. So your surgeon would come in. There's a woman named Lucy Thurston who has a mastectomy pre-anesthetic, and she writes about it in the 1840s. And she says that her surgeon determined that the breast had to come off. And he decided that he wasn't going to tell her the day that he was going to show up, because he thought that would calm her more. I mean, for me, that would make me a lot more anxious. So he shows up at her house one day, and he walks up the staircase into her bedroom, and he opens his hand and he shows her the knife, and he tells her to prepare her soul for death, which isn't very confidence inspiring. But this story really illustrates that wealthy people were certainly treated at home because there was this acknowledgement that hospitals were very dangerous. So you only went to the hospital if you were very poor and very desperate. So that is very different than how things work today. So the situation become critical. The microscope comes in. When Lister was a little boy, his father worked a lot with the microscope. He created various lenses for it. And so he grew up around this strange instrument. And I say strange because in medicine, it was seen as very suspect. A lot of surgeons and doctors believed that the microscope would make for lazy clinicians, and they would stop using their eyes to diagnose patients, and that they wouldn't trust their eyes as well. And beyond that, the idea was, well, okay, you look through a microscope, you might see something interesting, but how is it going to change how we ultimately treat a patient? Which was a fair enough point at that time. So it was just seen as sort of a wasteful toy. But Lister grows up around it, and so he takes the microscope with him to medical school when he goes in the 1840s to UCL in London. And it's really this journey with this microscope, looking at the different tissue from the patients who are suffering from septic conditions or die of septic conditions, and what he's seeing under the microscope, then pairing that with what he learns when he reads Louis Pasteur's germ theory. And I like to say that The Butchering Art is a love story between science and medicine, because it's one of the first instances, if not the first instance, where a scientific principle, which is germ theory, is applied to medical practice. So you get this unition of science and medicine, which of course now exists today. But yeah, the microscope is a very important part of the butchering art.
And you mentioned that Lister was really building on the work of Louis Pasteur. How did he build on that work? How are the two of them kind of connected together, because they did meet and they were actually like friends.
Yeah, they did meet. And actually, for a while, I really wanted to write the book so that it would be sort of one chapter Lister, one chapter Pasteur, and then we see their stories kind of meet in the middle. But the consensus at my publisher, which is FSG Scientific American, was that, and rightly so, I think, that Pasteur's story is a lot more known, and so that we really should just be focusing on Lister. But Lister is told about Pasteur's work randomly by a colleague, and this is the key that he was looking for. So he begins developing antisepsis, but it's many years before he doesn't reach out to Pasteur. He actually thinks that he's out of Pasteur's league, and it would sort of be inappropriate to write this great scientist. And Pasteur ends up hearing about Lister's work sort of randomly, and the two finally do start exchanging letters. And what's amazing is later in life, Lister goes to Paris to a ceremony to honor Pasteur, and he speaks for his old friend, who can't speak at this time because Pasteur, I think, has had his second stroke, and he's being honored, and he can't even stand without help. It's quite sad. And Joseph Lister goes to honor his friend, and he says about Pasteur what could easily have been said about himself, that Pasteur's work had saved many people's lives. But it really was sort of the meeting of science and medicine in this amazing ceremony. I believe there's a painting, or I think it's a painting of this moment. But it was truly a friendship at the end of both those men's lives.
What I really love is that in their, as you describe in their kind of introductory letters, they kind of fanboy over each other. Like, oh my God, you're so cool. No, you're so cool.
Oh, I know. I can't believe, Lister, that you could have done all that. I know. It's hilarious. There was some, I don't speak French, so also that was limiting for primary source material with Pasteur. I had to rely on translations, and that's also why I decided, he wasn't as prominent in the butchering art. But he's obviously an incredible figure, and I think that I'd love to see that story come out a bit more, maybe in the movie adaptation of the book.
And I also wanted to we talked a little bit about Victoria and Pasteur, but I wanted to talk about one of the other people surrounding Lister. His mentor, Dr. Syme, was called the Napoleon of surgery, which is amazing. But I was especially interested in Syme's daughter, Agnes, and we mentioned that Lister married her. And there's not really a lot in the book about her. What do we know about her?
Well, that goes back to the whole, this sort of these gaps in their marriage, these things that I would love to have known, like why they didn't have children, just the hints, the glimpses of these kinds of answers that I was seeking. But she's a very quiet woman. And what I love is that when Lister goes up to Edinburgh and he meets Syme, the Napoleon of surgery, who is also the cousin of Robert Liston, Robert Liston being 6'2", and Syme being quite a bit shorter, hence the name Napoleon of surgery. And he was very, he was a very fiery man as well, just like Liston. And he was fearless. He would perform some of these operations. One operation he performed was on a man who had this enormous tumor growing on his jaw in the 1820s. I think it was 1828. And this man actually goes to see Robert Liston because Robert Liston had just made a name for himself by removing a 45-pound scrotal tumor without anesthetic in under 4 minutes, and the patient survived. So this guy, Penman, who has this facial tumor, decides, I'm going to go to Robert Liston. I'm going to ask for this tumor to be removed by him. But Robert Liston refuses, which is tantamount to a death sentence from a surgeon like Robert Liston. So this guy, Penman, travels up to Edinburgh and he goes to see Syme, the Napoleon of surgery, and Syme agrees to do it. And for 30 minutes or so, Syme cuts away bit by bit at this facial tumor without any anesthetic. And the man survives. And there's actually a photo of him later in life. And he looks a little odd, but you wouldn't necessarily know he had undergone this really horrific surgery. So it's pretty amazing to think of. Syme has many children. Some of these children also died quite early from childhood illnesses, but he's very Victorian. He's got a big family. And he has another daughter as well who's more beautiful. But Lister, being the Quaker and being the quiet, somber figure, is instantly attracted to Agnes and actually notes to his father in a letter, it's her plainness that sort of attracts him, which I find kind of delightful about Lister. And they fall in love. And what was meant to be a very short trip to Edinburgh ends up being a very long, extended stay because he marries her and then he ends up going to Glasgow. And this is really important to Lister's story because if he hadn't stayed in Scotland, the story would have been very different. Scotland, for various reasons, which I talk about in the book, is much more scientifically minded in medicine. They're doing a lot more experiments. They're much more open to Lister's ideas when he starts to develop them. So if Lister had gone back to London as he intended, I don't know if this story would have ended quite the same way. So Agnes is very much a part of his sort of fate, so to speak. And what we know about her, well, like I said, she was very much in the background, transcribing his notes, helping with his experiments. And she was very much a scientific partner, although I don't develop this a lot in the book. She's fascinating from that sense. And I would love to know more about her story, but it's just one of those things, again, that we only really know her story through the men around her, through the letters of Lister. And she's kind of a shadowy figure, but I suspect a very important figure in his life.
Well, I'm glad she was there because it is very much a kind of high power, high class British white dudes kind of book.
Yes, I know. It's not hidden figures, like it's not one of those stories where we have this amazing, women coming to the forefront. And unfortunately, it's very difficult I would love to find, the woman in the 19th or the 18th or 19th century, who was shifting the paradigm. And maybe I will find her at some point. But it's much harder to find those people because they're not as well documented. And the same with the patients themselves. Remember again that they were poor, going into these hospitals. So we only have their experiences typically through the voices of the surgeons who are cutting into them and the case files about them. We don't necessarily have their words about how they felt or the terror of the situation or whether they were even given much of a choice in how they were treated, which I suspect they weren't. So this is the problem when you're writing a historical book. But yeah, I would love to find that woman to write that story at some point in my career, because that would be amazing. But it's going to take a lot of digging into the archives. But I hope, even though this is like a male white Victorian story, that it's such an important paradigm and it's such an important story. I hope people will enjoy it.
And yeah, I mean, you mentioned it's fun. It's a very fun, very informative book. It is a little stomach turning in places. Even for me, I have a very strong stomach. I mean, I wouldn't read it over breakfast, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
What do you want people to kind of take away?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. Because I tell people you should read The Butchering Art for many reasons. One of them should just be purely enjoyment. I love to immerse people in this world that's so different from ours, but yet familiar in surprising ways. So I want people to read it. It should be read like a novel. It should flow like a novel. So you should just read it and enjoy it and gather all these gruesome facts that you can horrify people with at cocktail parties. But also, I hope that people pick up The Butchering Art and they don't just look back at the past and think, well, how could people have thought that? I hope that they realize that science and medicine is always in flux, and what we know today isn't going to be what we necessarily know tomorrow. And that sometimes our biggest enemies come from within the scientific and medical community, because certainly the biggest pushback that Lister received was from his own colleagues. So I think, especially for people who work in science and medicine, we have to keep an open mind when these new ideas come along, because there's never been an instance where a paradigm has been shattered that there hasn't been resistance within the community. And of course, like, some of that resistance is rightly so. That's part of the process of questioning and pushing back. But I do think sometimes it can hinder progress.
And you mentioned this a little bit throughout our interview, but there's going to be a movie, which is awesome. What kind of movie is it going to be?
Well, hopefully a full feature film at this point. So my friend Alex Anstey, who's a brilliant director, I came to him one day. I said, could you do a book trailer for me? And it just got out of control. We got actors and we got some amazing talent to help shoot it. He called in every favor. And we created this sort of think it's about 6-minute book trailer in the old operating theater in London, which is an amazing space. And we recreated a pre-anesthetic and pre-antiseptic surgery with a young Lister in attendance. And we had so much fun doing it. And that was the moment where we got together and said, well, let's try to get the funding. Let's try to do the film. One of our friends, Lori Korngeibel, is a producer in LA, so she's helping us. We've started to get commitments from investors. And I think the next step's going to be approaching some actors, and it's really fun. This book is sort of my baby. As a writer, you can sell rights off to production companies or to studios, but I really want to be creatively involved in this. Especially since, as I alluded to before, this book was sort of born out of a desperate situation in my own life. So I feel very connected to Lister's story. I want to see it told right. You can see the book trailer on my YouTube channel, Under the Knife. I show it on my book tour, in my book talks, and I've had 3 men faint so far, while watching it. So, you've been warned if you go and watch it. It is pretty gruesome, but, hopefully delightful to see that kind of era reconstructed.
Well, Lindsey, thank you so much for spending time with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.
We've linked to information about Lindsey Fitzharris and her book, The Butchering Art, Joseph Lister's Quest to Transform the Grisly World of Victorian Medicine, at our website, scienceforthepeople.ca. We've also got a link for the trailer for the movie. Next, we'll be talking with Nils Hansson about the other huge revolution that changed surgery in the 1800s, the development of anesthesia. You don't want to sleep through this one, I promise. Stay tuned.
While we take a break, we thought we'd recommend another podcast that you might enjoy. If you like Science for the People, we think you'll also like Story Collider. Story Collider is about the human stories behind the science. Each week, tune in to hear scientists, science writers, comedians, and more tell stories that make you laugh, cry, and think. I've even been on Story Collider myself, talking about a time my own life collided with science in, honestly, a pretty tragic way. But this week, I'd like to recommend Story Collider's episode on women in science in honor of March as Women's History Month. Listen to Allison Williams and Sarah Meyer talk about the challenges they've faced as women in STEM and how they went forth and did science anyway. Their stories were infuriating, stunning, and inspiring. I can't recommend them enough. Check out Story Collider wherever you get our podcast. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Science for the People. I'm Bethany Brookshire. We've heard now about the development of the germ theory of disease. Understanding why wounds become infected has helped to save millions of lives. Before it, surgery was a court of last resort. Anytime someone cut into the body, they were risking infection and death. But there was another reason that surgery was something people tried to avoid. And that was because that until about 1847, not only did the patient risk infection, they were required to be awake, as their own legs were cut off or their eyes were taken out. Sometimes they even had to participate in their own surgery by holding certain positions. All of that changed with one of the biggest developments in medicine, the discovery of anesthesia. Here to talk with us about anesthesia is Nils Hansson, a historian of medicine at the Heinrich Heine University in Dusseldorf, Germany. Hi, Nils.
Hi there.
Now, let's talk a little bit about anesthesia, which was, if sterile surgery was kind of one of the 2 big developments in surgery in the 19th century, anesthesia was the other one. And people have been searching for something to kill pain since we've had pain. So all the time, lots of things have been tried. Some of the obvious ones was alcohol. Used to try and kill pain and sedate people as far back as ancient Mesopotamia, but it doesn't really work really well because people get alcohol poisoning, and before they get alcohol poisoning, you never really know if you're going to get a nice drunk, an angry drunk, a strong drunk. Alcohol is not reliable. But let's fast forward to the middle of the 19th century and the advent of nitrous oxide, which people probably know about as laughing gas. Can you talk a little bit about Joseph Priestley and Humphrey Davy? What did they do?
Yes, perhaps just a brief note to say something about the broader picture of surgery during that time. As you mentioned, the turn of the 19th to the 20th century appears, I think, from today's perspective at least, as a very dynamic era for the development of modern surgery. You mentioned antisepsis and asepsis. Hemostasis was also, you can refer it to as a revolution in surgery, but then also anesthesia. And even earlier, nitrous oxide is credited to Joseph Priestley, the discovery of nitrous oxide already in the 19th century. He was a English philosopher. He was a chemist. He was even a political theorist. So a man with many interests. And he has been credited then with the discovery of oxygen, although other scholars have also strong claims to that discovery. And I think that's like a pattern also when we talk about the history of anesthesia. There are many scientific priority disputes. It's hard to say who discovered what, when, and why. But Joseph Priestley is also credited for the discovery of nitrous oxide. I think it was in the 1770s. It's also known today as laughing gas. And the story or the therapeutic story of nitrous oxide has strong links to another scientist, Humphrey Davy, who published on nitrous oxide in the late 18th century, and he described two major effects when you inhale this gas. On the one hand, there is euphoria, perhaps even some mild hallucinations, and on the other hand, the pain-killing effects. And Davy suggested that inhalation of nitrous oxide during surgical operations would be helpful, but it would take a while before it was used on a larger scale. But he at least proposed the opportunity in one of his books.
One of the things I found very interesting was that nitrous oxide quickly became recreational. People had parties and would inhale nitrous oxide and get high because it is what we call a dissociative anesthetic. Yeah.
And I think there's also an interesting side note to that story. Like often with popular phenomena in medicine are somehow reflected in popular culture, and I apparently nitrous oxide also was a phenomenon in the British upper class in the early 19th century, and there are also some films titled "Laughing Gas," or where the narrative includes parties with laughing gas in the early 20th century. And I also think there's one movie featuring Charlie Chaplin. So that's a fascinating topic.
And it's not really in use today, nitrous oxide.
Not to that extent, for 150 years ago.
Right. It's still used at the dentist. You can get it at the dentist, and it's also used as a carrier because it's a gas. They can use it as a carrier for other more modern anesthetics. But in the realm of other super fun things we tried for the sake of science, cocaine was tried for anesthesia by Auguste Bier. And he gave it intrathecally, which is an injection in the spine, and that's the way epidurals are given today. Can you talk about cocaine?
Yes, cocaine is actually has a long story. It's an old drug in the history of anesthesiology. Think for example on the Inca. The Incas, they chewed coca leaves a very long time ago. But during the 19th century, there was one quite interesting was one interesting presentation by the Viennese ophthalmologist Carl Koller. He experimented with cocaine in New York and presented his findings at a conference in Heidelberg in 1884, and after that there were plenty of scientists and physicians who experimented with cocaine. One U.S. example is William Stewart Halstead in Baltimore. You can see in the series The Nick, there is one character who I think is partly based on the biography of William Stewart Halstead, where he experimented with cocaine. But talking about August Beer, a German professor of surgery. He became famous worldwide for his experiment of spinal anesthesia. And the funny thing about that is he did a self-experiment in 1898. He injected a small dose of cocaine into the fluid surrounding the spinal cord, and he got his assistant to test it on himself, but it didn't quite work out. So he then tested it on his assistant, August Hildebrand, and then it worked. And how he had to show that the effect of this experiment. So he hammered and even burned his assistant. It's in the protocol. It also says that he pulled out his pubic hairs of the assistant, and apparently it worked. So
that
nowadays,
poor guy.
he is credited for having introduced the spinal anesthesia into clinical practice.
Well,
A spectacular example.
Cocaine, it doesn't really work that well. I mean, it does work, but, one of the problems with cocaine is that it is not a sedative, it is a stimulant. So you don't feel pain, but you feel really good and very awake. And so we don't actually use it anymore, but we do still use it locally. It's very good for a local anesthesia. We actually still use it for local anesthesia for things like eye surgery.
Yes, that was what Carl Koller did in the late 19th century, in the 1880s.
And you mentioned to me earlier that August Beer almost won the Nobel Prize for using cocaine on his poor assistant, but he didn't. Why didn't he win it?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, and Beer is also a good example for scientific priority disputes. One of his former teachers, Heinrich Quinke of Kiel University in Germany, had done lumbar puncture, so had some similarities with August Beer's experiment. And also there was a US physician, James Corning, who also had done similar experiments. So the Nobel Committee couldn't really say, is he the first one to do something like that, or did he get the idea from other people in the scientific community?
Man, what do you got to do to win a Nobel Prize? Now we get to William Morton, who is probably the most famous name in the development of anesthesia. If you know a name in the development of anesthesia, you probably know William Morton. And he apparently found out about ether as an anesthetic because he was a big dude in ether parties in the 19th century. He and several of his compatriots were ether party boys, which I think I want on a t-shirt now. Can you tell me what Morton contributed to anesthesia?
Yeah, then we have to travel back in time. We had Koller in 1884 and August Beer in 1898, but already in 1846, William Morton introduced the use of ether as an anesthetic. There is one anecdote. Allegedly, he stood before a large audience and had a colleague with him, Warren, a surgeon. And Morton administered ether to one patient, and this surgeon Warren could then remove a tumor from his neck, and then the story goes, a new era dawned. Allegedly, and that's often quoted, Warren immediately after the operation said that, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." And that is, there's hardly any paper on the history of anesthesia where these words are not quoted.
And one of the interesting things, you sent me a paper that we're going to link to in the show notes, that's also by Thomas Schlich, about how anesthesia patients before the advent of anesthesia, patients had to be kind of active participants in their own surgeries, which could be good. You know, they could hold certain positions. They could keep an eye on their doctors and make sure the doctors were not, I don't know, getting distracted. And Thomas Schlich argues that the advent of anesthesia fundamentally changed the doctor-patient relationship. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and that's linked a bit to the previous question. Then, before anesthesia, patients experience surgery in full consciousness, and they were an active part in the operation. Schlich describes that they should hold, the surgeon might ask them to hold their body in certain positions, and so the operations were hard work for both the surgeon and for the patient. And at the same time, there are some there are documented operations where the patient, when the operation was ongoing, they could communicate, and the patient could even sing or chatter or smoke during surgery. But I think the case is that they struggled and suffered a lot.
Yeah, I was going to say probably the ones where they were chatting and smoking were not full amputations.
No, that's true. But with the introduction of anesthesia in the mid 1840s, surgeons could then manipulate body parts and structures in a way that allowed surgery to advance. So in practice, the lack of cooperation from the unconscious patients could also pose new problems. So now the surgeon could not get any help from the patient any longer. And in that way, the anesthesia changed the relationship between the surgeon and the patient. There were some profound effects.
On the other hand, it's probably a very good thing. I was thinking of a book that I read called Dr. Mutter's Marvels about Mutter, who was a big person in the field of plastic surgery in the early 1800s. And he was a big person in plastic surgery before anesthesia, and he was thrilled by the development of anesthesia because before, when he had to do things like repair cleft palates, he would have to go and for several weeks massage the palate of the person he was going to operate on until they lost their gag reflex so that he could operate, because otherwise you'd be operating and the patient would throw up.
Yeah.
And that's bad. Very bad. Yeah. But do you think Schlich actually has some interesting ideas that maybe he kind of suggested in his paper that maybe patients have become almost too passive? Do you think that's become kind of a theme? I think the interesting point in his paper is that if you introduce technologies in clinical practice, they often really change the relationship between the physician and the patient, and I think this is a good example, or a very clear example of how that relationship changes. But I think also we should keep in mind when we look back at these 150 years that we think that the introduction of anesthesia today perceived as revolutions, but back then, 150 years, there were also many other accounts of huge problems associated to the anesthesia, like death and other things. Side effects include death.
Yeah, side effects, yes.
Well, Nils, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. To go with another surgery pun, you helped us stitch together the narrative of anesthesia. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We've linked to more information about general anesthesia and Nils Hansson's work at scienceforthepeople.ca. There we've also got links to Twitter, Facebook, and iTunes, where you can tell us all about the new iTunes app and how it keeps deleting your podcasts, or at least it kept deleting mine, and tell us that you like us. You really like us. Or you hate us. You can tell us that too. We've also got links to our Patreon page, where for a few small dollars per month you can support us and get cool access to things like extra content. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week on Science for the People.
Science for the People is produced by Rochelle Saunders and edited by Ryan Bromsgrove. Helen Quivalon is our publishing liaison. We get research help from Josh Witten and consulting support from Desiree Schell. Our frequently seen guest hosts are Marion Kilgour, Anika Hazra, and Jessica Yaros. Our theme song is called Binary Consequence, and it was written and recorded by Fractal Pattern. Science for the People is entirely listener-supported. You can find us on Patreon, where you can support us with monthly donations in any amount, or you can send us a one-time donation in any amount via the donate page of our website. Science for the People is created in partnership with the Skepchick Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on the intersection of science, popular culture, politics, and social justice. You can find out more about Skepchick at skepchick.org. The show is hosted by science news writer Bethany Brookshire and me, Rochelle Saunders.